Hello, my friends. Hello, and welcome once again to stately Vaughan Manor, where Roger and I have returned to talk about pastiche. We're talking about pastiche today. Pastiche, something I've had to deal with quite a lot recently because we're in the middle of Sumerian September, a reading event devoted to Robert E. Howard and his greatest creation, Conan the Barbarian, and there's been a lot of pastiche written about Conan. Some of it's good, some of it's not so good. But what is pastiche anyway? Well, I'll tell you. Let me break out this strange and mysterious book that I found in the library. Strange and mysterious book. Okay, it has a little definition of pastiche, and it's very simple in this book. A dramatic, literary, or musical piece openly imitating the work of another artist. So basically, it's copying another artist openly, saying, look, this is what I'm doing. And usually, when it comes to books, usually it's when you take a famous literary creation, a famous literary character, for example, and you write your own story about that character. This character that has been created by another person, another artist, another author. And this has happened to every single famous literary character, I'm pretty sure. Pastiches are very, very common. Some are more successful than others, but yeah, they exist. They always will exist as long as there are famous literary characters. And the character that's had to deal with the most pastiches is probably this one, probably Sherlock Holmes. Sherlock Holmes is the most famous literary character in the world, I think. I can't, off the top of my head, I can't think of a character more famous than Sherlock Holmes. Everybody knows the name Sherlock Holmes. And for those of us who read, we know, most of us who read know that Sherlock Holmes is a literary character created by a particular author, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created Sherlock Holmes. He wrote a bunch of stories and novels about Sherlock Holmes. But Sherlock Holmes is so popular that, a bunch of other writers wanted to write about Sherlock Holmes. And they have. Oh man, have they. And of course, Sherlock Holmes has been adapted into other media, about every other kind of media you could think of. I don't even know how many movies about Sherlock Holmes have existed. Who knows? Television show after television show has been created based on the character of Sherlock Holmes. Again, some more successful than others. There have been radio shows. There have been everything. There's everything. Plays, everything about Sherlock Holmes. Very, very popular character. Frequently pastiched. Now, like I said, Sherlock Holmes was created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. He wrote a few books worth of Sherlock Holmes stories and novels, but they all can fit in one book. This is the complete Sherlock Holmes. It's a fairly good-sized book, but it all fits in here. How many pages is this particular volume? 1,122 pages. So it's a great big book, but it does all fit in one volume. And this is it. This is the canon, the official canon of Sherlock Holmes. All written, of course, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. If it's not Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, it's not really Sherlock Holmes. It is an imitation. And I think most people get that, but that doesn't mean that we can't read or enjoy pastiche fiction. I actually have nothing against pastiche fiction, as long as it's done right. I think to get pastiche fiction right, you have to have respect for the creator of the work. You have to have respect and understanding of the character. You have to have enough talent to write a decent pastiche. But really, respect for the author, respect for the character, an understanding of the character, and some ability to write a story about this character that feels like it actually exists in this character's world and that this is actually the character. And sometimes that just doesn't happen. And I think with Sherlock Holmes, there's a lot of bad pastiche out there. There's a lot, from what I've read, some of it's good, but a lot of it's not so good for me. I tend to steer away, and because of that, I tend to steer away from a lot of Sherlock Holmes pastiche. Not that I'm against it, like I said. It's fine. And the reason I'm okay with it is because there is an overall understanding that Sir Arthur Conan Doyle created this character, and the real Sherlock Holmes stories are the stories created by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. So I think as a character and, as a series of stories and novels, Sherlock Holmes has not been, badly affected by pastiche. Sherlock Holmes is fine. The original Sir Arthur Conan Doyle stories are available to everyone, and they are frequently read. And so, I think Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, he's done all right as far as being his famous character being pastiched. That is not always the case. Certainly not the case with this character. So this month, for Sumerian September, I'm dealing with the 12-volume series of books, originally published by Lancer, later published by Ace, that came out in the late 60s and into the 70s, that for the most part introduced Conan to the modern public at the time. L. Sprague de Camp took Robert E. Howard's character, and he took Robert E. Howard's Conan stories, published them in paperback, edited this series, but also, in some cases with some of these stories, heavily edited them. But he also added to the series. He took these stories, which like the Sherlock Holmes stories, were not told in the chronological order of the character's life. But he arranged everything in chronological order and decided to add his own stories. And he got Lynn Carter, who was no stranger to pastiche. He got Lynn Carter to help him write brand new Conan stories, which they added to, fill in the gaps in Conan's career. And they kept having to write more of them, because every time they put in a story, there was another gap that they had to add a story to. And then there's another gap, they had to keep on writing Conan stories. And eventually they wrote more Conan fiction than Robert E. Howard did. I'm pretty sure, but it was all mixed in with Robert E. Howard's original fiction, which is something that should not have been done, would never have been done with Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. But the thing with this series is the Conan stories, a series of fantasy stories that was published in Weird Tales, a pulp magazine. And Robert E. Howard is the greatest pulp writer of all time. But L. Sprague de Camp, I think, he really enjoyed the Conan stories, I believe. But he didn't have a ton of respect for the Conan stories or Robert E. Howard as a writer. He always gave you the sense that he felt superior as a writer to Robert E. Howard. He always felt, I think, that he was a better writer, and he was kind of slumming it with these Conan stories. But this is also where he was making all of his money. Because, in fact, Robert E. Howard was a better writer than L. Sprague de Camp could ever hope to be. It's just true. And when you read this series, as I'm doing now, it's just so glaringly obvious how much better Robert E. Howard was than L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter when it comes to writing Conan. I mean, with all of these stories mixed together, it's pretty glaring. What should have been done, of course, is that the original Conan stories should have been printed in a series of paperbacks. They would have been just as popular. You could have had the great Frazetta covers on them, and they would have sold a ton. And then, if you wanted to, you could add your own stories and write your own pastiches and sell those. There was certainly a market for it, but that would have been the way to do it. Let Robert E. Howard's stories stand on their own, and then add to the series. But that's not what L. Sprague de Camp did. And this was L. Sprague de Camp's meal ticket, I think, for a long time. And if you're a Robert E. Howard fan at the time, if you were a big Robert E. Howard fan, this pissed you off because you wanted the real thing the way Robert E. Howard wrote it. And you wanted that available, and for years it wasn't. For years, this was the only way you can get it. And then, to make matters worse, eventually this series went out of print, and only pastiche fiction was written about Robert E. Howard's Conan. You couldn't even buy Robert E. Howard's Conan. You had to get pastiche fiction about Conan. And for years, that was the case. Fortunately now, Robert E. Howard's Conan is available, and much like Sherlock Holmes, you can get it all in one book. It all fits in one book. But this is the real thing. This is the Conan canon. Everything else is just, basically, pastiche fiction is a kind of fan fiction. It's no more legitimate published Conan fiction that was not written by Robert E. Howard. It's no more a real Conan story than one that you might write yourself. Which is fine. You want to write a Conan story, you can. And like I said, I have nothing against it. As long as the original fiction is available and it's understood that this is the writer who created this character and these are the actual stories. And then everything else, pastiche-wise, can be enjoyed, as you want to enjoy them. But too often, particularly in this series, it's really jarring because you have the real Conan, and then you have this character that pops up in stories by L. Sprague de Camp and Lynn Carter, and too frequently it just seems like a character that wants to be Conan, but just can't quite pull it off. It sort of feels like I don't know if how many of you watch Star Trek or are Star Trek fans and you watch Strange New Worlds. Well, if you're a fan of the original series, and then you watch this new show, particularly the character of Spock. I mean, the whole thing is a little off, but particularly the character of Spock. Let's take this character, which was pretty firmly established, and we understood everything about Spock after the initial series and those initial films. And then we have this Spock in this show, and so much about this Spock is just wrong. It's just wrong. So much is wrong that when you watch the show, even though it's very well produced and the actors are, very good and everything's very well done, it just feels off. It just feels wrong. And that too often is how you feel when you read this original series of books. When you get to the stories that are not by Robert E. Howard, that's how it often feels. You're reading it and it's just like, well, this isn't the way Robert E. Howard would have told this story. It just feels off, and it feels like you've got a character who's not really Conan, but like I said, he's trying to be Conan, but he just can't pull it off. He says things that Conan wouldn't say, the world that he exists in doesn't really seem like Conan's world. It seems like, an imitation world, and it just doesn't feel right. And that is all forgivable if you just say pick up a Conan pastiche that was written separately from the original series of stories, isn't trying to intrude itself upon them. like a lot of the Tor books, for example. A lot of those were not great, but some of them were pretty good. And they were separate in a way that these were not, because what L. Spradley Camp and Lynn Carter were trying to do is make their stories part of the official canon of Conan, when really only the original author can write a canonical story about their character. And that's always been the case. Other characters have been pastiche. Tarzan, for example. And at one time, the paperback publisher of Tarzan tried to add a book written by another author and make it part of the official series, but it didn't take. Again, because it clearly was not written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and just felt off. Only Edgar Rice Burroughs could write a Tarzan story that was a real Tarzan story. You could have other pastiche Tarzan novels, and they could be entertaining and they could be really good, but they will never be part of the real original series. And I think Tarzan is a character that's done all right with that for the most part. Sherlock Holmes is a character that has definitely survived pastiche and does okay. Conan has had a rough go. Conan's had a tough time with pastiche. And that's all I have to say about pastiche fiction, Roger. Do you have anything to add? There's been a lot of pastiche fiction written about Roger, but, that's all crumbled to dust by now. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.